Well, good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. Visitors we have with us, we appreciate you being here with us this morning. Have any questions, please feel free to ask us about anything. It's good to see those back. Shane, Barbara, good to have y'all back with us. Recovery going well? Doing well. Good, well. Anybody else we need to make mention? I don't have the bulletin in front of me. Sister Betty's having sinus surgery Tuesday. Okay, so we'll keep her in our thoughts and our prayers as she undergoes that. And it'll be successful. Yeah, Travis Wood. So remember that family. Devastating news, no doubt. Remember the Wales family from Ingemar. Okay, and their loss. All right. Got a lot of sickness and things going on in this world. Anybody else that need to make mention of? Not. Richard, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Yep. Amen. Thank you. All right, we're in chapter 19 of Luke. We're going to be looking at the conversion of Zacchaeus this morning, and if we move on through there, we'll begin and we'll look at a parable beginning in chapter 11 as well. We'll just keep moving along. At this point in time in the life of Christ, we see he's moving forward. He's headed towards Jerusalem, his final week upon earth here. So there's a lot of things that have been happening in these last few chapters, and they're just on the heels of each other as he's moving towards, he's traveling, heading towards the week of the Passover, heading towards Jerusalem, heading towards the cross. And so we come up on chapter 19 in this encounter and this conversion of a man named Zacchaeus. And there's a lot of significant things that we can find out about Zacchaeus here that kind of, it's ironic, I guess, it's guidance that falls right in line with what he's been teaching up to this point. We can see a lot of comparisons and a lot of contrast. But Jesus has entered and passed through Jericho. He's entering in the city of Jericho, and he's on his way to Jerusalem. And it seems as though there's a purpose. There's a divine purpose of why he's coming through here. And meeting of Zacchaeus, and we'll get to that in a minute as we go along. But there's a couple of things that stand out automatically about Zacchaeus that we will hit on here that I want to talk about. Let's look at the first 5 verses of chapter 19 here. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Those two things right there, keep those in the back of your mind. Those are going to come back to us here in just a little bit. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. There's another one. Keep that in the back of your mind, climbing into a tree. And when he Jesus came to the place. He looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste or hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. Zacchaeus was not just a tax collector. He was a what? But what kind of tax collector was he? He was the chief tax collector. He wasn't your ordinary tax collector. He was the man. He was who everybody else under him, like Matthew and Levi, answered to. And he was rich. And he was rich. When Jesus passed through Jericho, he's on his final trip. This is his third and his final trip to Jerusalem. And Zacchaeus, we see, made an effort to want to see him. Zacchaeus wanted to meet Jesus. Now, is this out of curiosity? We don't know. Was it divine? Could be. But Zacchaeus, we notice that Zacchaeus ran to meet him. It could be that he had heard about Matthew and how Jesus had called Matthew and forgiven the sins of Matthew, a tax collector. It seemed that Zacchaeus probably had a pure heart. His name means pure, is what Zacchaeus' name means. So, him being of short stature, and forgive me, but every time I read this, that VBS Bible song keeps coming into my head. I keep repeating it, you know. But he wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to meet Jesus and have an opportunity to meet Jesus. But he knew he was going to be hindered from it. He knew he was going to be hindered. He'd get lost in the crowd. He was short of stature, kind of like me. Short of stature and get lost in the crowd and wouldn't be able to see him. So he said he ran ahead and he climbed up in a sycamore tree. Now here we have a man of prominence. Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector. People answered to him. He was over a lot of people. But you notice the one thing that he is not ashamed to do. Now, look at Zacchaeus. He's a man in his prominence. How many men of that prominence and that importance and that stature would go climbing up in a tree like a kid? That shows you how important it was for him to see Jesus and get to meet him alongside the road. He wasn't embarrassed to do something of this nature because it was more important for him to get a glimpse of Jesus and to meet Jesus than it was any ridicule. And besides that, he was already probably getting ridiculed because of his short stature, because of who he was. And he was a chief tax collector. And this was somebody that was absolutely hated by the Jews. I mean, the tax collectors like Matthew was already despised, but then you got somebody like Zacchaeus who was probably even more despised, by the Jews. The other thing is, we see Zacchaeus coming to Jesus and making this effort. What did Jesus tell us back in the previous chapter? He told his disciples, unless you become to me as what? Little children. What was it about the little children? It wasn't just so much that their innocence, but it was their humbleness, their eagerness, their desire to want to be in front of somebody, be at Jesus. What does Zacchaeus demonstrate when he runs ahead and climbs up in that tree? His eagerness, his childlikeness, that innocence of wanting, the importance of wanting to see Jesus. So we can kind of see Jesus talk to his disciples about being like little children, having that attitude. Now here we see a man demonstrating that attitude, that unwillingness. There was no shame in climbing that tree because it was the importance of who he wanted to see. And so he sought to see Jesus. So he runs ahead and he climbs up in the sycamore tree because he knew that Jesus was going to pass that way, and he wanted to get a glimpse of him, perhaps to let Jesus see him. Excuse me. And so when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and he saw him. There's no record of it, but somehow or another, Jesus knew who his name was, didn't he? Jesus knew him. He called him Zacchaeus. He knew exactly who he was. He knew the situation. And notice what he says there. He says, Zacchaeus, make haste, or hurry up and come down, for today, he goes, I must stay at your house. So Jesus, there was an importance that Jesus had to stay there at his house. Now, if you think about the city of Jericho, let me say this before we go any further. So he made haste and he came down, but when they saw it, they all complained about it. Everybody. This guy's going to eat with a sinner. The importance of the city of Jericho was it was where a lot of the priests lived. The priests lived in Jericho, so it was kind of a prominent city. The priest of the Pharisees, they lived here. So here was Jesus, the Messiah, coming into this city, and he walked right past all the chief priest's house, and he goes to the house of a sinner. Somebody the Jews just absolutely despised. Somebody that the Jews hated. Somebody that didn't. But he says there, I must stay. And he announced it. It's not something that he walked in and he hid and he did it undercover, behind the scenes. Jesus made it known to all these priests, to all these Pharisees, all these people that was there. I'm going to Zacchaeus' house, and that's where I'm going to stay today. But that word must there, and I think that's the same word that is used in John chapter 4. When Jesus was going through Samaria, he said, I must needs go through Samaria. And the disciples and the apostles asked me, well, why? We can go around it and still get to our destination. We can still get to our destination. Jesus could have stayed in any house, but he said, I must needs.
It's urgent.
It's urgent. There was a divine importance there. It says that he had to pass through Samaria. Why did Jesus have to pass through Samaria back in John chapter 4? Right.
In my life, a man like that people look down on like they did actually, and it says, consider they all began to grumble and said, all the crowd there grumbled, tax collector cheated everyone else.
Right.
What all we did was not to say. And then Jesus, the later says it's about salvation. It's one of the great examples of Jesus' compassion.
The word there, I've talked about this before, the word there means it's necessary, like it wasn't optional.
Right.
He had to. And to answer the question about before in Samaria, we'll answer that next time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell you. I think the real answer is it was necessary to find it was God's will.
I think
Jesus
so.
is fulfilling God's will. And it was God's will that Jesus stay at Zacchaeus' house that day.
Absolutely.
And that's the simple answer.
That's the simple answer. I mean, Zacchaeus was an example of God's will, and it was necessary. This wasn't just by chance accident. This was Jesus on the final destination, still doing God's work, still doing God's will. And I think Jesus, there was the eagerness of Zacchaeus. You see so many things that in Zacchaeus that Jesus has been talking about up to the character of Zacchaeus. We talked about that childlikeness, running ahead, wanting to eagerly see Jesus, climbing up in the tree of there.
Here we also think maybe it's exactly for those 80 people. They said he was soon. He's so many. That's what we would expect. Soon as him something.
Exactly right. I mean, everybody knew who Matthew was, and Matthew was following him out. And no doubt by this time, Jesus' name was a household name. Matthew's name was a household name. So here's, and Zacchaeus' name means pure. So there had to be some consciousness there on Zacchaeus' part of wanting to change there and see that. And it says there that when he came down, that he received Jesus joyfully. He was excited that Jesus recognized him and wanted to see him. But just like he had to go through Samaria because of his appointment to meet the woman at the well, he had to come through Jericho and meet Zacchaeus as an example there. And I think when we look at Zacchaeus, the other thing that stood out, and I told you to keep this in the back of mind, it says he was chief tax collector. But Luke makes it a point to say that, and he was rich. And he was rich. I think when we look at the conversion of Zacchaeus here, it's a perfect illustration of the truth that we read back in chapter 18, verse 27. If we go back to chapter 18, verse 27, go back there, and Jesus has just counseled the rich young ruler. You know, when that rich young ruler told him, I've done this, I've done that, I've done this, and what does Jesus tell the rich young ruler to do? Go sell all he had and give to the poor. And he walked away sorrowful. Right. And what does the disciples look at him and say, well, you know, this guy can't get into heaven. Who can, you know? And Jesus tells them what? That it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. But then he goes back and he says what? With God, all things are possible. Those things that seem impossible to man, with God are... Well, we get over here to Zacchaeus, and salvation is offered to Zacchaeus. But Luke makes it a point to point out that he was a rich man. So Jesus just proved with Zacchaeus what he just taught back in the previous chapter, that things are possible with God. Here, I just told you that things that seem impossible for man are possible with God. Now he's demonstrating it right here. Zacchaeus was that rich man, and ordinarily it would have been impossible, according. But Jesus said, you know, he humbled himself. He demonstrated a humble attitude. He demonstrated an eagerness to know Jesus, to meet Jesus. He was running to Jesus. He didn't sit back and just wait on Jesus to come to him. He went to Jesus. He seen his need for Jesus. He seen his need for salvation. And Jesus recognized that.
That's the thing. Go back into these other chapters and look at all these examples of the blind man, the rich young man, and this first one is another. Every one of them had to show at least some measure of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like the told. You go back up into verse 42 of chapter 18, he's talking about the blind man. He said, Jesus said to him,
Any comments? Any other comments? So I think when we look at Zacchaeus here, we can see a lot of the characteristics of the people that Jesus had been describing, of how our character was to be, of our attitude that we're supposed to be up until this point, of how we are to seek him and to acknowledge our dependence upon him and approach him. And then it says that, verse 8, then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, I give. Notice he didn't say I gave it. He said, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I take anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he is also a son of Abraham. And I think verse 10 is kind of key to the book of Luke. It's kind of the theme to the book of Luke. Jesus kind of just sums it all up right here. Jesus is making it known to the crowd, to the multitude, to those around. This is his purpose right here. This is why he is doing what he's doing. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. That's his purpose. And Zacchaeus was lost. And Jesus was here to save men like Zacchaeus. But it doesn't say, I don't think Zacchaeus was bragging on what he's doing when he says, I give half my goods to the poor. I think that's a result of his salvation. I think it's a result because of what Jesus has done for him. He wants to make amends. He wants to make a retribution. That's an act of repentance. If you steal a car, and then you become obedient to the gospel, we've always heard the excuse, well, you got to restore it, You just can't keep on going and stealing cars just because you got to make some retribution. Anybody got any comments about Zacchaeus so far? I know I can't be covering him that well. Why does he call him a son of Abraham? Isn't he a Jew already? I mean, Zacchaeus was a Jew. Do what?
I'm going to say it's because of his faith. If you had the faith of Abraham, God told him to get up and go.
Right.
He got up and go in.
I think you hit right on it there, bro. Zacchaeus, it wasn't just because he was a Jew by birth, but it was because of his faith that he demonstrated. Jesus means this in a spiritual sense, that Zacchaeus was a true son of Abraham. In Galatians 3:7, Paul, I think, put it very well. He said, it is those who are of faith that are the sons of Abraham. It is those who are of faith that are the true sons of Abraham. Those that have the faith of Abraham, like that Merle said. That willingness to just accept it, accept Jesus, accept God and his word, accept Jesus at his word, and to act upon it. The Pharisees, for the last several chapters, several weeks we've been talking about them. The Pharisees were hanging their righteousness upon what? What did they hang their righteousness upon? Their birthright, their deeds, everything that they had done. Look at what I've done. There was no humility. There was no humbleness. There was no acknowledgement that without God in their lives, there was nothing. Just because they were physical descendants, they outwardly kept the law. They crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's, checked all the boxes. That's what they hung their hat on. But that's not what Jesus was looking for. That's not what he was actually looking for.
I wonder if his comment here, when he says he also is the son of Abraham, is this intended for
think so.
And the attitude that they had towards him because he was a tax collector. I mean, I didn't go back and look at this, and I don't know, we could get into the discussion if you want. I haven't spent the time to really.
I think you're right, because as a tax collector and a chief tax collector, he'd pretty much been excommunicated.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, from the Pharisees hadn't, even though he was a Jew, the Pharisees had nothing to do with it. They kicked him out. They didn't discuss nothing with him. Probably family and friends. He was isolated.
But what he says here in the Greek, what Luke says he says, which I take Luke's word for, is when he says, like the New American Standard says, I will bestow, or I will give. But the Greek is present active that he is now doing. I am giving. And
Yes.
I am deserving. And it's almost like Zacchaeus is saying, I'm not cheap. They have excommunicated me because I'm a tax collector. But I'm still giving alms, giving to the poor. I'm still, if anybody thinks I'm taking anything, I'm giving back.
Right.
Just because I'm rich, I'm a tax collector, doesn't mean I'm not worthy of salvation. Now, I don't know. I'd have to study this more. But,
Right.
the way it reads to me is not I will do it, but he is. So I
Yeah.
wonder how much of this, as it often is with Jesus, is being directed in the attitude of those who are looking down on him.
Well, I'm sure that's, yeah. I mean, and I think you're onto that something there, because he does this in a crowd. I mean, he does it. I mean, when he met the woman at the well, it was him and her. And he told her to go tell everybody to bring him back. But Jesus makes a point to do it in a crowd where everybody can hear him and everybody can see his act.
The lesson here is not maybe the position of that is, but the lesson to us, don't reject somebody because of who you think they are.
Yes. It's true. Right. What have you done? Yeah.
Salvation has come to his house, but what about you?
Right. Are you as eager for that salvation as Zacchaeus is? Right. Exactly. You hanging your hat on your personal deeds.
But again, the other lesson here for us is the desire is absent.
That's
It is desire to see Jesus and to speak to him and spend time with him and know him. And wanting the salvation and the acceptance that Christ offers that he wasn't getting from his own brethren.
I think that's a huge, and I kind of touched on that earlier. It's that desire. It doesn't. He said he ran ahead. I mean, he didn't just casually mingle through the crowd hoping that he'd see Jesus. He made a concentrated effort to
He
get.
didn't get discouraged when he couldn't see.
Right.
He give up.
He found a different way to go. Right.
How many of us are willing to climb the tree?
Exactly. And that's why I refer back to Jesus. He told the disciples when they were rebuking the parents for bringing the children to him, he says, unless you become childlike. Well, Zacchaeus displays a childlike attitude right here. Like, I'm not embarrassed to go climb this tree. I want it. I need it. And so the lesson there is, do we have that desire? Do we have that desire to run after Jesus? Do we see that need to run after Jesus?
When Jesus invites us into himself into our home, into our life, how quickly do we accept and open our home to him?
Yeah, because I think this is the only time, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the only time where he actually says, I'm coming to your house to stay the night. And so, and how did Zacchaeus accept him? Good point. Did he say, well, wait just a minute now. Let me go home and clean the floor. Let me go home and put things in order. Let me go home and make sure I got enough food. Come on. Come on. Do what? He's joyfully. He was excited that Christ would be willing to come to his home and accept him for who he was. points. Good thoughts. Anybody else? Anything else jump out about Zacchaeus to anybody? I think when we look at Zacchaeus, there's so many characteristics about the attitude and the trait of how he approached Jesus. His eagerness, his joyfulness, his desire, willingness to do whatever it took to get close to Jesus and have him be a part of his life that we can see here.
So do you think they didn't know about Matthew?
Do what?
Do you think these people didn't know that Matthew was a disciple of Christ? Because he was a tax collector.
I think they had to. I think maybe, it doesn't say, but to me, Jesus' name and Matthew's name, by this time and point in their life, they had to be common household names. And Zacchaeus being a chief tax collector, we're not told it, but I can make the assumption maybe even Matthew answered Zacchaeus. So he knew what Jesus had done for Matthew and he wanted to be a part of that. He wanted
We
some
know
of that.
that Matthew continued his secular activity after following Christ.
He said he left all, yeah. My impression is, and I don't know that, but my impression is that when Jesus said, "Follow me," he left everything and dedicated the rest of his remaining life to following Christ. But see, Zacchaeus being a chief tax collector, he kind of farmed out that business. And so those that answered to him in that, and it may have very well been that, hey, I lost one of my guys. What's going on with this? Who is this that he's following? And over the course of time, Zacchaeus had an eager desire to have that same thing in his life.
But this says the conduct of the trip to see who Jesus was. But like his curiosity to see, he was wondering, this is the way out. He was wondering, he knew a fellow tax collector, Matthew, knew that follow this guy, and all these kind of things. He's thinking, I'm probably just like him. I can do this. And that's what he did. The joy comes into his life, but it's like he's also recognized his need.
Right.
Yeah, maybe it's the fact that if he knows Matthew, and we're assuming,
Yeah.
but if he knows Matthew and sees the community that Matthew is now a part of with Jesus and his disciples, and he is still, as you said, excommunicated from, maybe he sees that opportunity to be part of that community.
He wants to be a part of that.
Yeah.
He wants what Matthew's got.
Yeah, exactly.
He wants what Matthew's got. And is that the way, and he sees a change in Matthew's life, in Matthew's lifestyle. And is that not, as Christians, how we are supposed to be in the world? People are supposed to see us in a change in our lifestyle and a change in our attitude, say, hey, what is it that makes you behave like this? Can I have this? And so I'm sure a lot of it was the curiosity of who is this Jesus that Matthew is following. And again, we're making the assumption that they knew each other. But I think Luke makes it a clear point right off at the very beginning to point out to us that Zacchaeus wasn't just your average tax collector. He was the chief tax collector. He was rich. So there was people that answered to him. So Zacchaeus was a prominent in the tax collector world. He was a prominent man. Any other thoughts, comments?
One thing that stood out to me, though, people basically judged him off his title
Yes.
instead of actually knowing the works that he was doing, because he was actually doing good work. They considered him a sinner, but from the text, he was actually doing what we all supposed to do. And Jesus
Right.
accepted him.
And that's a good point, Travis. And Jesus had already talked about that same thing. That's another good point. They talked about that same thing, how that the world and people judged people off of appearance. The Pharisee, when we go back to the Pharisee and the publican in the temple, Jesus made a point, the Pharisee would be considered the man who was a shoe-in for salvation, because he knew the law. He kept alms. And the publican was a man who, by appearances only, would be a cast out, but yet Jesus proved to us right the opposite because of their attitude and who they, and their humbleness. Any other thoughts? I don't think we're going to get into the parable of the minutes today. Possibility. And it may have just been that he was trying to keep the old law. I mean, I think, I'm not familiar with the old law, but I know you go back to Leviticus and it says if you've taken something from somebody, you should restore it fourfold. And so here's Zacchaeus is, people accusing him of taking things falsely, wanting to restore it fourfold, make things right with people, make amends with people. So here he was just trying to keep the law. We know Cornelius was a devout man. He followed the law. He paid alms. We're not told that Zacchaeus could have been in that same mindset. Any other thoughts, comments before we get into?
Colleen just whispered a point to me instead of saying it out loud. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And kind of a good point, again, we're assuming here, but what if he is the chief, and so he's got others under him? What if it's the fact that those under him are taking more than they're supposed to, and he's taking that and giving it back?
Could be.
It's not that he himself was taking it, but he was receiving it because of his oversight.
Right. Very possible. Maybe. There's a lot of things we
I
can
think
assume here.
sometimes we give Zacchaeus a bad rap.
We do.
And we don't know all and we're reading into it more than what we probably should instead of taking out of it the points that you brought up today.
I think we'll end this. I think the main points when we look at Zacchaeus is his eagerness and his desire to see Jesus. And I think it's also his willingness to accept Jesus and realize his need upon Jesus at any cost. Right. And his eagerness and his desire and his acceptance. And Jesus, basically, we talk about knocking at the door. Jesus, we sing the song, Jesus is knocking at the door. Okay, Jesus is knocking at Zacchaeus' door, and Zacchaeus doesn't put him off. He brings him on in. He brings him on in and accepts him. Any other thoughts? We've got 1 minute left. If not, we're going to end it right there, and we'll pick up in verse 11 next Sunday. Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. Great class.